Welcome to the TPN studio. In studio with me today, presenting today's session for schools is Wendy Porter. Welcome, Wendy.
Thanks, Jade.
I am Jade Matembo and I will be facilitating the question and answers for today's session. We understand the pressures that schools are currently facing when it comes to collecting fees and managing delinquent parents. TPN is here to alleviate that stress and that pressure and to streamline the process from the get-go when parents are applying to your schools. We are here to make sure you are placing quality parents in the schools, and Wendy is also going to delve into how TPN can assist with qualifying exemptions. Before we get going, I'd just like to go into the house rules. Firstly, please make sure you are logged into YouTube so you are able to access and interact with us on the live chat. We will also be posting the feedback form in the last 15 minutes of the session, so please do complete that. If we seem a bit blurry, please click on the cog at the bottom of your screen and make sure it is set to a minimum of 720p. On that note, Wendy, let's get going.
Thanks, Jade. Morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So as Jade mentioned, the most important step of the process is to do your credit checks. Obviously, for private schools, you then have the ability to base your decision on the credit check information that you see. And then, of course, for public schools, the exemptions is what I will then talk about based on the information that we see on the report. First and foremost, you must have consent from your parents to run a background check on them. That's very important. Should you, for example, perform a credit check on a parent without having their consent, there's a whole process that follows, but the long and the short of it is you can be fined up to 10% of your annual turnover for not having consent to run the credit check. So that's very important. So what is the point of doing a background search on your parent? The point is, for private schools, you want to gauge and sort of base your risk on the way a parent has previously handled any school fee accounts, obviously, and then, of course, how they have conducted their payments in terms of their traditional credit agreements, because that is a direct indication of how they're going to pay your school fees. So when you perform the credit inquiry, the information that you see, you can then say, okay, fine, this is a good parent, or no, sorry, this is a bit risky, or no, sorry, we're not taking you on. For public schools, you can't base your risk on a credit report. However, if you do run a credit inquiry, you can obviously verify the information that a parent has given you on the application forms. So obviously for the public schools, parents go on that online system, and then of course, once they've been accepted, then the parent has to come and give you the supporting documentation. So the credit inquiry will then verify that information that the parent has given you. And of course, for exemption purposes, you obviously, parents will, parents, their claim to fame is, oh, I'm unemployed. I can't afford any school fees. I can't afford a cent. So this credit inquiry will also then tell you, is a person employed, who they employed with, what their position is, their period of employment, and of course, if they've left the business, their reason for leaving. And that is one of the databases that TPN specialize in, is employment data. The second one is obviously school fee data, and the third one is your rental data, how people pay their rent every month. Right, so with the credit checks, you'll obviously need to have the person's consent, but also you'll have to have the ID number or passport number, name, surname, address, and cell phone number to run the inquiry. So on your application forms, when they fill in their details, that's the information that you use to perform the credit check. And ideally, you need to include the consent clause on your application forms, because it's on application that you're going to run your credit check. You're not going to run a credit check after you've accepted a parent. That's working backwards. So your first step is on your application form, get consent, and then of course you can run the actual credit inquiry. So you've all received your usernames and your passwords to the TPN system. You log in, and at the top you'll see the heading credit checks. Click on the heading, and then you'll click on perform a new consumer credit check, because that's obviously doing a credit check on a person. Your inquiry reason, we always it's defaulted to rentals / setting limit for goods or services. So as a school, you guys are obviously in the service industry, and therefore you can leave it on that inquiry reason. Your reference, it's not a mandatory field, but you can fill it in. For example, public schools, if you are doing a credit check for the purposes of exemptions, you can literally go and type in the word exemptions. And then of course, when we send through your itemized billing at the end of the month, you will see on your itemized billing, it will then say, this is the list of credit checks, and out of these were the ones for exemptions, as an example. So then you'll fill in the ID number, name, surname, address, and cell phone number. In the case of a passport number, you'll click change to passport number. And then of course you will also then have to have the person's country of origin and their date of birth to perform the inquiry. If you are performing an inquiry on a passport number, remember you're only going to pick up information of that person within the borders of South Africa. So if, for example, they come from America, you're not going to pick up their credit information from America. It'll only be within the borders of South Africa. Fill in all the information, click next. The credit score, you will always select it to basic credits. And then you'll see the ID verification is ticked. This is very important. The ID verification obviously verifies that the person is who they say they are. And then of course, you will also then pick up, it will also display a photo of that particular individual. NCA compliance, that is just confirming that you have got consent to run the credit check. Jade, do you have a question?
I have two quick questions, Wendy.
Sure.
I have a question from Wanda. Wanda is asking, does the TPN system provide a format of an application form?
We don't. So you'll obviously have to have your own application form. However, in terms of the consent clause, we can email you the consent clause to insert on your application form, or when we emailed you your login details, the consent clause was attached to those login details as well. So you can go and find it there as well.
Wanda, I would add that you can, in the near future, or possibly next year sometime, look out for a TPN for Schools pack.
Yes.
It's definitely not off the cards. And then I have another question from Liz Morley. Can you run a check on an existing client for a new exemption request?
You can, but remember you have to have consent.
Thank you, Wendy.
Pleasure. Okay, so then you obviously tick the box NCA compliance, and then you'll click next. For data providers to TPN, you will have access to the Smart Check inquiry. If you don't submit data to TPN, you will not have access to the Smart Check inquiry. If you're wanting access to the Smart Check inquiry, please give me a call, and I will then explain to you how to submit data. And it will only be your employment data that gives you access to Smart Check. And then, of course, once the Smart Check inquiry is enabled, you will then be able to perform this inquiry I'm going to show you now. Okay, so you'll notice the Smart Check inquiry is already ticked. If you don't have access to Smart Check, you will then be able to perform individual inquiries. If you select the TransUnion report, for example, you still will be able to see judgment and default information on the TransUnion report. The only information you will not see is the payment profile information of an individual. So in other words, their accounts that they have, how they've paid their traditional credit agreements, etc. On the Smart Check inquiry, the TransUnion portion of it will include all the accounts that a person has open, their monthly installments, etc., which I'll show you now. And based on that, you can then ascertain affordability, particularly for the private schools. You will be able to, at a glance, see if a person can afford your school fees or not. Right, so on the Smart Check inquiry, it's ticked. You then say perform credit check. What we do here is we put up a summary report for you first. Basically, this summarizes the information from the different databases within the Smart Check inquiry. So as you can see, it will then display the person's photo. It will then tell you, is the person married? Are they male or female? Is their actual ID verified through HANIS? And then, of course, the national, what is it, Jade? National Population Register. And then, of course, it'll tell you if the ID is a pass or a fail. Then what we do is we give you a scoring of the particular person. So it runs from A to F. A is obviously impeccable in terms of how they've conducted their credit and rental and school fee agreements. And then, of course, F is poor. Then what we do is on the TPN database, we will then tell you out of their school fees and rental agreements, what the percentage is in terms of how they've paid those agreements. On TransUnion's report, in terms of their traditional credit agreements, again, we put up a donut and give you a percentage on is the person in good standing or whatever the case may be. And then, of course, we will also then highlight any negative information if a person has got any judgments or defaults, and it will tell you the person has got 2 judgments, 1 default, etc., etc. This graph that you see here is based on their rental and their credit agreements. So it summarizes in a graph form the good, bad in terms of how they've paid their credit agreements. If a person has got judgments or defaults, it will highlight that information in red under the credit report summary, and it'll tell you on which credit bureau that information sits. So we've got 1 default on TPN, and we've got 2 judgments sitting on TransUnion's database. Further down, it then summarizes the credit agreements that a person has. So this particular person, in total, out of all their credit agreements, they owe 1.8 million rand is outstanding in terms of debt. On a monthly basis, with all the monthly installments that they've got to pay for all their credit agreements, totals 108,000 rand that they have to pay out every month just on credit. And then it'll also show you if there's any arrears balances, and this particular individual has got 523,000 outstanding in terms of arrears for credit agreements. And then, of course, further down, it'll show you addresses, telephone numbers, excuse me, etc. With regards to the summary of the credit information, this is where you can ascertain affordability. So this particular individual, these amounts are quite extreme, but I can tell you it is a real person that we've taken. So, for example, if you see a person has to pay out 20,000 Rand a month on the credit agreements, and you can see from their pay slip, perhaps they bring home 25,000 Rand a month, and your school fees is 3,000 Rand a month. Remember, with the 25,000 that they bring home, they've got to pay out 20,000. So it leaves them with 5,000 Rand, of which they need to pay rates and taxes, lights and water, they need to put in petrol, they need to buy food, and then of course your school fees are 3,000 Rand. So at a glance, this summary is going to tell you, can the person afford the school fees or can they not? Right, on the TPN report, this TPN information is what we as a credit bureau specialize in, which is your rental data and your school fee data. So this particular individual, it also shows if the person is a member or director of a company, and then it'll show you the lease information, so who the person rents from, what the rental address is, the rental amount, and again a breakdown of how they've paid their rent on a monthly basis. So this particular individual has not paid rent for 4 months. Jade, you've got a question?
I do, Wendy. I have a question from Louise Stoppelberg. She says, your system talks about rentals. Please advise how that links in with applicants who have home loans who are not necessarily tenants.
Okay, so on the Smart Check inquiry, I'll show you now, Louise, it will also include if a person owns property and the property address and when it was bought and how much it was bought for. So I'll go into that just now. So besides the rental data that I'm showing you, on the Smart Check inquiry, you can then also see if a person owns property. For public schools, if a person claims to be in your feeder area and they rent property, you can, as I said earlier on, verify the information that they've given you on the application form against the rental information that is loaded on that particular person. Right, and then of course your school fee data will also come up on this report. It will tell you which school the parents had their children in previously, what the school fee amount was, and again a breakdown of how they've paid their school fees every month. So that's on the TPN report. Then we scroll up, and here is your employment information. So this is another database that TPN specializes in, as I mentioned earlier. And for public schools, this is where you are going to confirm if a person is employed or are they not. And that would be for your exemption purposes. So it will tell you again which company the person is employed at or was employed at, what their position is, are they casual staff or are they full-time staff, and again start and end date. If the person has left the company, it will show you the reason for leaving. So it will either say resigned or dismissed, or in this particular case where it says terminated, that doesn't mean the person was fired from the company. It means they had a contract in place and that contract then came to an end. So that's what terminated means. Dismissed is obviously when a person is fired. And then, of course, for exemption purposes, you are wanting to see, is a person currently employed? If they are currently employed, it means they're earning an income. So for those parents that say, I'm unemployed and I'm applying for a full exemption, and here you see, hang on a minute, the person is currently employed, it means they're earning an income, and that bears the question, why then is the parent applying for a full exemption? They shouldn't be. So it's a way to include this information in your exemption process. Right, on the TransUnion database, that is your traditional credit information. As mentioned earlier, this Smart Check inquiry on the TransUnion tab will include the accounts that a person has open, along with any judgments and defaults that the person has. Excuse me. So here it will say, okay, this particular individual has got a Markham's account. He opened the account in 2016. His monthly installment is 1,740 Rand. He currently owes 15,000 on the account, and he is overdue. He's got an arrears balance of 3,400. And this payment profile data works a little bit differently to ours. Ours will show you did not pay, or paid on time, or paid late, whatever the case is. TransUnion displays their payment flags as zeros and ones. So what that means is a zero is they've paid the monthly installment on time and in full for that particular month. If it shows a 1, it means they are 1 installment behind. And here you can see they are 2 installments behind. So that's how TransUnion displays their payment history. And then, of course, I'm not going to go through the whole report, but it'll show you each account that the person has. So that was the Markham's account. Here's a Truers account, Mr. Price. We've got an ABSA credit card. And, of course, that summary I showed you earlier on with the payment information, that information is pulled through from this data. And for private schools, that is how you then, as I said, ascertain affordability. Right, Louise, for your purpose, the deeds information on the deeds report is going to show you if a person owns property. Again, for public schools, again, if the person is in your feeder area and you then want to verify the address, if they own property, you can then verify the information on the deeds data that we display as well. Right, qualifications also pulls through. This will obviously confirm what tertiary education or qualifications the person has obtained. So for the purposes of employment, if you're going to employ somebody within your school and a teacher or whatever, and they have certain degrees, you can then verify their qualifications through the qualification tab on the Smart Check inquiry. Okay, Jade, are there any questions? No, you're fine? Okay. The other inquiry I want to show you is the trace inquiry, and this is very popular inquiry in amongst the schools. So you will have a parent who is in your school and then they leave, but they still owe you money. But they change their cell numbers, they change their addresses, they change their work. You now need to trace them so as to try and collect your outstanding monies. The trace inquiry, again under the heading credit checks, is the third option down, perform a new consumer trace inquiry. You can either trace under a person's ID number if you have it. If you don't, you can then search under their surname, but you also have to have their date of birth. Or you can search under their telephone number, be it a cell phone number or a landline number. So on the left-hand side, you can search under these 3 options: ID, surname and date of birth, and telephone number. Select whichever one is appropriate. Fill in the particular details. Click Next. And what it does is it lists all people that are associated with, for example, if you put the cell number in, all people that have been associated with that particular cell number, as well as close matches. So, for example, our driver here at TPN, his number and my cell number is exactly the same, except his number ends in a 2 and mine ends in a 7. So if you had to put my cell number into the trace inquiry, it'll pull through my details and it'll pull through our driver's details as well, further down on the list. So once you have a look at the list and you determine, okay, Joanne Soap is the person that I'm looking for, you open up that particular record. The trace inquiry looks at our TPN rentals data, our school fee data, and our employment data, as well as the whole of TransUnion's database for information that is associated with the cell number or the surname or date of birth that you put in. Again, we put up a summary report, and then of course to go into each inquiry on the TPN information, it will then show you in date, the latest information in date order. It will show you their cell numbers, their home numbers, previous addresses, etc. And the same for TransUnion. It also puts it into date order that you can see the most recent updated information in terms of addresses, telephone numbers, cell numbers, etc. And then, of course, you can pick up the phone and start phoning these numbers that are displayed in the hopes to get in touch with the person that you are looking for. Right. That is basically all in terms of credit checks for schools. Jay, do we have any more questions? We fine? Okay. Thank you very much. If there's anything more that you need to know or you need additional information, please do not hesitate to contact us either via email address helpdesk@tpn.co.za, or you can contact us telephonically 0861 876 000. And yes, thank you very much for joining us, and have a good week further.